We've already covered global warming and climate change that is being driven by the burning of fossil fuels and other activities that release greenhouse gases. We've also talked about our biogeochemical cycles and how human activities can increase the carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen in an environment up and over the natural processes that cycle these nutrients through. There's another video on ecological threats covering invasive species. This remaining video is going to talk about some of the other global threats to biodiversity. There aren't going to be too many local examples in this one, mostly because it's just a laundry list and not all of them will necessarily apply to our area, although they may not be on a very large scale. Some of these threats to biodiversity are very prominent in some locations and not in others. Biomagnification is the accumulation of chemicals within a food chain. So basically what happens is that the primary consumers eat something, or well, really any level, but at some level in the environment, the primary consumers consume a toxin and then it gets passed up to the next level consumers and so on. If those consumers cannot process it out, cannot remove it as waste, then it just accumulates in those organisms. And then as you get to higher levels in the food chain, they reach toxic or detrimental levels. So a prime example of this is DDT. I'm not even going to attempt the butchering of that word because every time I do it gets worse. DDT is a pesticide that was sprayed in the environment to control mosquito populations and other insect populations. It does not break down, and instead it just persists in the environment. So it accumulates in fats in higher trophic levels. And one of the problems with DDT is that it interferes with eggshell formation. So some of the larger birds the predatory birds were consuming fish and other organisms. And when they would lay their eggs, the eggs would be weakened in response to this accumulation of DDT. So when birds would sit on their eggs, the eggs would crack and their hatchlings or their babies would die. And so this largely affected our predatory birds, those that were eating fish and other organisms from lakes. This particular example is food chain, Lake Michigan food chain. So it wasn't just Lake Michigan, it happened in a variety of places, but this does show the accumulation of DDT in the seagull population who were of course feeding on fish, and you can see that it is amplified exponentially in those birds of prey. Another huge threat to biodiversity is habitat destruction. This can happen anywhere, although we tend to think about it in terms of tropical rainforest. This is where it's a really big deal, but it can happen in any place where natural habitat is cleared, and it happens for a variety of reasons. Some of it is just urbanization, people looking for areas to build homes, so they clear an area, a small area or a large area. Conversion of habitat to agricultural land to support those individuals who are urbanizing an area. Strip mining and quarrying are also reasons for habitat destruction. This graph on the right shows the relative abundance of threatened species for each of the major types of threat. So you can see that In areas with habitat destruction, up to 80% of the species in that area are threatened. So very, very big impact on the native organisms in an area. You can see other threats: invasive species pollution and overexploitation. May not be as intense, but all add up to the overall effects on an ecosystem. One of the main ways that habitats are destroyed is by deforestation. So this is basically just removing all of the trees. One very common method is a slash and burn method, where individuals go through the environment, cut things down and set it on fire. Is a quick way to clear the land. I mentioned in an earlier video that this releases carbon dioxide by burning, but then it also removes the plants in the environment that would have counteracted the increase in carbon dioxide. Of course, when you lose the plants, you also lose the animals. The example here, the ivory-billed woodpecker, this went extinct in the United States due to logging. So cutting down of trees for paper products and lumber and whatnot. Deforestation by logging may be replenished depending on how well the logging companies are managing their forestry, but this does take time to replace those forests. Planting agricultural crops or urbanization are, of course, going to destroy the native habitat there, so it's going to remove all of the native plants from the area and replace them with agricultural crops or with urban areas. Agriculture is a major source of deforestation and destruction of natural habitat. This is sort of a double-edged sword. You need agriculture to sustain the population in an area or globally. But then when you overdo it, you actually decrease the efficiency of the agriculture. And so then you have to do things like adding in fertilizer, using pesticides and whatnot to increase your output. So if we're going to maintain our human population, and we all like to eat, we do need to have agriculture. We do need to have livestock and those organisms that we like to eat. But if you are utilizing the land in this way, you just have to be really careful that you are paying attention to the potential hazards of agriculture, which includes soil erosion. By taking out the big trees and the native bushes, you can reduce soil stability. So roots provide a lot of stability to an environment, and when you remove those and have the relatively shallow roots of many of our agricultural plants, soil erosion can become a big deal. This, of course, is going to increase flooding, because as you reduce soil health and the ability of the soil to hold water, flooding is going to happen. As you continue agriculture in a particular area, soil fertility is going to go down as those plants pull out the nutrients, and then the plants are removed from the environment so the nutrients are not replaced. Silting is a washing of soil into rivers as you get that flooding and loosened soil due to changes in the plant life that is there. Desertification is when a region dries out. So this can be another side effect of agriculture. Land use for crops and livestock is culturally and regionally dependent. So some areas are more heavily used than others. The Midwest is a big agricultural area because the historic prairies and grasslands were very, very fertile soil. And so they were a prime place for growing things like wheat and corn, raising your cattle on lush grasses and whatnot. But some areas based on climate or topography aren't going to be using agricultural land nearly as much. Overexploitation is where you remove organisms for human use or consumption at an unsustainable rate. So basically, you remove them from the population. So, for example, for fishing, and the mortality rate or the loss of those organisms from the environment surpasses their ability to reproduce. So this graph on the right shows predators eating the effect of humans on, the effect of non-human predators on natural populations. So natural carnivores, natural herbivores, relatively small compared to the effect of humans on these other food chain groups. So human hunters have a big impact on top predators, reducing those organisms because historically they have been seen as a competitor for livestock and personal property. And then you have herbivores and middle-level carnivores. Humans are impacting those as well. Fisheries are a very common place where we see overexploitation. So many regions and cultures depend on aquatic organisms for their food, but humans affect these in very large numbers. So there are a few examples of organisms that have been that are threatened or have gone extinct due to overexploitation. Some very common examples: rhinoceroses and elephants in Africa. Some other big game animals that are used for hunting or as prey for hunting, human hunting. Many of those have been pushed to the brink of extinction. Whales, many of our larger the baleen whales, were pushed to the brink of extinction by the late 80s due to commercial whaling. And at that point, the countries that were involved basically realized that they could not sustain commercial whaling without some major changes. So this graph here shows the decline in the number of animals that were present. And then in 1988, there was a moratorium, which basically is essentially a stop on whale species, and many of them have recovered, although not to prior levels. Passenger pigeon and Carolina parakeet are two other examples of organisms that were driven to extinction by human overexploitation. So fish are a very common example. You can see two examples here: cod fishery and Key West fishing that basically led to crashes in fisheries, natural or commercial, in those areas. And plants are not immune to overexploitation. The example here is Rothschild's orchid. This one, it was pushed close to extinction because of poaching. And I don't know about you, but I don't normally think of people poaching plants. I think of people poaching rhinoceros and elephants for their tusks. But this is a very weird example of a really cool plant that collectors all over the world were trying to get. They grow very slowly. They're very hard to grow. And according to the internet, because I don't know too much about these guys, their leaves are clear and they are collectors' items in the plant world because they're just so pretty and so interesting. So it's not just animals. Plants can be affected by overexploitation as well.